I'm recording this because I need someone to know what happened. Not for validation, not because I expect you to believe me, but because keeping it inside has been eating away at me for 6 months now. My hands still shake when I think about that night. I work construction now, in the city, surrounded by noise and people and concrete. But back in March, I was doing something different. Something I thought would be an adventure. I took a temporary job with a logging crew in the Cascade Range, just outside of Forks, Washington. The pay was good, the work was hard, and I needed both. I'd never done anything like it before. I grew up in Seattle, spent my whole life around pavement and traffic lights. The idea of spending 6 weeks in the deep woods, cutting timber, felt like the kind of experience that builds character. Turns out, it builds other things too. Fear, doubt, a permanent sense that you're being watched even when you know you're alone. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If you're interested in hearing what really happened out there, if you want to know what I saw in that cabin, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. I'm not monetizing this. I'm not trying to build a brand. I just need this story to exist somewhere outside my own head. So please, subscribe, and let's continue. The crew was small. 8 of us, total. Most of them were lifers, guys who'd been doing this for decades. They had that weathered look, you know? Skin like leather, hands that could crush rocks. They didn't talk much, but when they did, it was usually about practical things. Weather, equipment, which trees to take down next. There was a foreman named Dutch, a quiet guy in his 50s who'd been logging since he was 17. He ran a tight operation. No nonsense. No drama. We stayed in a cluster of cabins about 12 miles from the nearest town. The main camp had a larger building where we ate meals together, but we slept in smaller structures, basic one-room cabins with bunk beds, a wood stove, and not much else. No electricity. No running water, except for a communal pump. Cell service was non-existent. We had a CB radio in the main cabin for emergencies, but that was it. You were cut off out there. Completely. I didn't mind at first. It felt liberating, actually. No emails. No social media. No news cycle grinding away in the background. Just work, food, sleep, repeat. The days were brutal. We'd start at dawn, work until our bodies gave out, then collapse into our bunks and do it again the next day. My muscles screamed for the first 2 weeks. I lost 12 pounds. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in years. Present. Grounded. Connected to something real. The forest itself was beautiful in that overwhelming, ancient way. Massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks towering overhead, so tall you'd get dizzy trying to see the tops. The light filtered through in shafts, illuminating floating particles of sawdust and pollen. Everything smelled like wet earth and pine resin. It should have been peaceful. And for a while it was. But then little things started happening. Small things that were easy to dismiss individually. But when you added them up, they formed a pattern. Tools would go missing from where we'd left them, only to turn up somewhere else the next day. We'd find equipment moved during the night, repositioned in ways that didn't make sense. Dutch blamed it on animals, maybe a black bear getting curious. We all accepted that explanation because the alternative was unsettling. There were sounds, too. At night, lying in my bunk, I'd hear things moving through the underbrush outside. Heavy footfalls that didn't match the rhythm of a deer or elk. They were too deliberate, too slow. And sometimes there'd be this low vocalization, almost like a moan, but deeper, resonating in a way that made your chest vibrate. The other guys heard it too, but no one talked about it. There's this unspoken rule in places like that. You don't give voice to your fears because once you do, they become real. The night it happened was a Friday. Most of the crew had decided to head into town for the weekend. There was a bar there, a tiny place called the Timber Room, and they were going to blow off steam. Dutch asked if I wanted to come along. I told him no. I was exhausted. My back was killing me, and the idea of sitting in a cramped truck for an hour each way, then drinking warm beer in a dive bar, didn't appeal to me. I said I'd rather rest, maybe read, enjoy the quiet. He looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe. Or warning. But he just nodded and said, "Keep the stove going. Gets cold at night." Then he left with the others. I watched their truck disappear down the dirt road, taillights fading into the twilight, and I felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, some solitude. The cabin I was staying in was one of the smaller ones, set back from the main cluster by about 50 yards. It was basic. Rough-hewn log walls, a single door with a simple latch, 2 small windows with shutters that didn't quite close all the way. There were 2 bunk beds, a wood stove in the corner, a table, and a couple of chairs. My belongings were minimal. A duffel bag with clothes, a few books, a journal I'd been meaning to write in but never did. That was it. I made myself dinner on the camp stove outside. Just ramen and some canned chili. I ate watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was stunning. For a moment, I felt content. This was why I'd come out here, to experience something pure and uncomplicated. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped fast. I went inside, stoked the fire in the wood stove, and settled onto my bunk with one of my books. It was a thriller, something about a detective chasing a serial killer. Ironic, looking back. The lamplight from the oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest had gone almost completely silent. No birds. No insects. Just the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of wind through the canopy. I must have been reading for about an hour when I heard it. A sound that made me pause mid-sentence, my eyes lifting from the page. It was a rhythmic thumping. Slow and deliberate. Boom. Boom, boom, like someone hitting the exterior wall of the cabin with the flat of their palm. I set the book down and listened. The sound continued. 3 hits, then silence. Then 3 more. I told myself it was nothing. A branch blown by wind hitting the logs. But there wasn't any wind. The air outside was still. I stood up and walked to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Nothing. The thumping had stopped. I waited, holding my breath, and then it started again. But this time it was on the opposite wall. Boom, boom, boom. My heart rate picked up. I went to the window and peered through the gap in the shutters. Darkness. Just the vague shapes of trees and the faint glow of starlight. I couldn't see anything. The thumping stopped again, and for a minute there was complete silence. I started to convince myself I was being paranoid. Isolation does things to your mind. Makes you jumpy. I went back to my bunk, picked up the book, and tried to focus on the words. That's when I heard the scratching. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Not frantic, like an animal trying to get in. More methodical, like someone dragging their nails down the outside of the door, testing the wood, feeling its texture. The sound went from top to bottom, then stopped. Then it happened again on the window frame. Long, slow scrapes that made my skin crawl. I stood up, my book forgotten. My mouth had gone dry. I looked around the cabin for anything I could use as a weapon. There was an axe outside leaning against the woodpile, but I'd have to open the door to get it. Inside, there was nothing. Just my pocket knife, which suddenly felt laughably inadequate. The scratching stopped. I heard footsteps. Heavy ones. They moved slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, each footfall creating a dull thud against the earth. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. They were bipedal. Whatever was out there was walking on 2 legs. I moved to the window again, pressing my face close to the gap in the shutters. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, but it was enough. A silhouette passed in front of the window. Tall. Easily 7 feet, maybe more. Broad-shouldered. Covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb what little light was available. It moved with a strange grace, not clumsy or lumbering, but fluid, purposeful. I stumbled backward, my legs hitting the edge of the bunk. My mind was racing. What the hell was that? A bear? No. Bears don't walk upright like that. Not for that long. Not with that kind of posture. My hands were trembling. I could feel adrenaline flooding my system, making everything sharp and surreal. The footsteps stopped. Everything went silent again. I stood there, frozen, listening to my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Minutes passed. Nothing. I started to wonder if it had left, if whatever it was had moved on. Then the door shook. Not violently, not like someone trying to break it down. It was a push. Gentle almost, testing the resistance. The latch rattled softly. I watched, unable to move, as the door flexed inward slightly, then returned to its frame. Another push. This time harder. The wood creaked. The latch held, but barely. I needed to hide. That was the only thought in my head. I looked around frantically. The cabin was too small. There was nowhere to go, except there was a storage closet, more of a cupboard really, built into the wall near the stove. It was meant for firewood and supplies. I yanked open. It was cramped, maybe 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. I shoved aside some kindling and squeezed myself inside, pulling the door closed as quietly as I could. Through the thin slats of the cupboard door, I had a narrow view of the cabin. I could see the front door, the table, part of the bunks. My breathing sounded deafening in the enclosed space. I tried to slow it down, tried to stay quiet, but my body was in full panic mode. The door rattled again. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The latch lifted. Not broken. Lifted. Like someone had figured out how it worked. The door swung open slowly, and a gust of cold air rushed into the cabin, making the lamp flame flicker. It stepped inside. I could hear it breathing. Deep, resonant breaths that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The smell hit me next. It was overwhelming, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else, something musky and organic that I couldn't place. It made my eyes water. From my hiding spot, I could see parts of it as it moved through the cabin. A massive hand, easily twice the size of mine, with long fingers ending in dark, thick nails. The hand reached out and touched the table, running along its surface almost gently. Then it moved to the bunks, grasping the wooden frame, testing its weight. It was examining the space, slowly, methodically, like it was trying to understand what these things were, what this place was. There was an intelligence to its movements that was deeply unsettling. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was something else. I watched as it moved to my duffel bag. It picked it up, surprisingly delicate, and turned it over in its hands. It opened the zipper, the sound loud in the silence, and pulled out one of my shirts. It held the fabric up to its face, and I realized with horror that it was smelling it, learning my scent. My heart was hammering, so hard I thought it might explode. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle any sound. Sweat was running down my face despite the cold air. The creature dropped the shirt and moved to the table where my journal lay open. It leaned down, and I could see more of it now. The massive torso, covered in dark brown fur. The thick neck. And then, for just a moment, I saw its face. It was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. It had features that were almost human. The structure of the skull, the placement of the eyes. But it was distorted, elongated, covered in hair. The eyes themselves were dark and deep-set, but there was something behind them. Awareness. Recognition. It looked at the journal, at my handwriting, and I swear it tilted its head like it was trying to make sense of the symbols. Then it straightened and turned toward my hiding spot. My entire body locked up. It took a step closer. Then another. It was moving directly toward the cupboard. I could hear its breathing getting louder. It stopped right in front of the door. I could see its torso through the slats, rising and falling with each breath. The silence was absolute. I didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't even blink. I could feel its presence, just inches away, separated only by a thin wooden door. Time seemed to stretch. Seconds felt like hours. And then it did something I still can't explain. It made a sound, not a growl or a roar. It was vocalization, but different. It started low, like a rumble in its chest, and then it shifted, became higher, more modulated. It sounded like it was trying to form words. Broken, distorted words that didn't quite work. The sounds came out slowly, separated by pauses. They watching you. The voice was deep and wrong, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of gravel. But the words were there, unmistakable. I want to pause here for a second. I need you to comment below. Tell me what you think really happened in that cabin. Was it warning me? Threatening me? Or was it something else entirely? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I need to know. I'm not the only one trying to make sense of this. After those words, the creature went silent again. I stayed frozen in the cupboard, too terrified to process what I just heard. Did it speak? Or was my mind creating patterns from random sounds? I still don't know. It stepped back from the cupboard. I heard it moving around the cabin again, slower now. It went to the door and stood there for a moment, its massive frame blocking the entrance. Then it did something that still haunts me. It walked to the center of the cabin, bent down, and placed something on the floor. I couldn't see what it was from my angle, but I heard the soft clunk of it being set down deliberately. Then it left. It walked out the door, its footsteps fading into the night, and it was gone. I stayed in that cupboard for hours. Long after the footsteps disappeared. Long after my legs went numb and my back started screaming in pain. I stayed there until the first light of dawn began seeping through the cracks in the shutters. Only then did I finally push the door open and stumble out. My body was stiff and shaking. I could barely stand. The cabin looked exactly as it had before, except for one thing. In the center of the floor, placed with obvious intention, was a smooth river stone. It was large, about the size of my fist, and it had been positioned perfectly upright, balanced on its narrowest edge. There was no way it had fallen there. No way it had rolled. It had been placed. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. Was it a message? A marker? A warning? I didn't touch it. I was too afraid to. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I found the evidence I knew would be there. Footprints. Massive ones, pressed deep into the soft earth around the cabin. Each print was at least 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They circled the entire structure. On the door frame, there were scratch marks, deep gouges in the wood, that went all the way through the outer layer. And on the wall next to the window, about 8 feet up, there were more scratches. Whatever had been out there was tall enough to reach that high while standing on the ground. The door itself had been pushed back into place after the creature left. It was hanging slightly crooked on its hinges, but someone or something had made an effort to close it behind them. The crew came back that afternoon. I was sitting outside when their truck pulled up. Dutch got out first, took one look at me, and his expression changed. He walked over slowly, his eyes scanning the cabin, the ground, the marks on the walls. "You all right?" he asked quietly. I tried to explain. I told him everything. The sounds, the creature, the way it had come inside, the stone. I showed him the footprints, the scratches, the door. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. The other guys had gathered around, and they were looking at the evidence too, but nobody was saying anything. Finally, one of the older loggers, a guy named Frank, who had to be in his 70s, spoke up. "You're lucky," he said simply. "Real lucky." "Lucky." I repeated. "That thing could have killed me." Frank shook his head. "If it wanted you dead, you'd be dead. It came inside. It knew you were there. Hell, it probably knew exactly where you were hiding. But it didn't touch you. It was curious. That's all. They don't usually let people see them like that. And when they do..." He trailed off, his eyes distant. "When they do what?" I pressed. "When they do, it means something," he said. "But I don't know what." Dutch put a hand on my shoulder. "Why don't you take a few days? Head back to Seattle. Clear your head." But I didn't take a few days. I left the next morning and never went back. I told them I had a family emergency. They didn't question it. I think they understood. That was 6 months ago. I moved back to the city, found a job, tried to return to normal life. But normal doesn't exist anymore. Not for me. I can't go near wooded areas without feeling watched. I can't hear certain sounds, deep vocalizations, or heavy footsteps, without my body going into fight or flight mode. I have nightmares where I'm back in that cupboard, watching through the slats as something impossibly large moves through the darkness. I've done research since then, more than I probably should have. There are hundreds of reports like mine. 1,000, maybe. Loggers, forest rangers, hunters, hikers. People who've encountered something in the deep woods that shouldn't exist. And the details are remarkably consistent. The size, the smell, the intelligence, the feeling that you're being studied rather than hunted. I still have the stone. I couldn't leave it behind. I don't know why. Maybe I needed proof, even just for myself. It sits on my desk now, a constant reminder that there are things in this world we don't understand. Things that exist in the spaces between our cities and our certainties. I don't know what came into that cabin. I can call it Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name makes it easier to categorize and dismiss. But names don't capture what it was. They don't capture the intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate way it moved, the sounds it made that were too close to speech. What I do know is this. It let me live. It came into that cabin, it knew I was there, and it chose to leave me unharmed. That choice is what terrifies me most. Because choice implies thought. And thought implies, what? Consciousness? Intent? Something that sees us the way we see them, as curiosities to be studied and then released back into our habitat? I think about those words it tried to speak. They watching you. Was it warning me about others of its kind? Was it telling me that I was being monitored, assessed? Or was it something else entirely? A message I'm too limited to understand? I'll probably never know. But I do know that I can't unknow what I experienced. I can't unfeel the weight of that presence, can't unhear those impossible vocalizations. The world is bigger and stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. And sometimes, if you go far enough into the wild places, you brush up against that strangeness, and it brushes back. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to my story, I have one more request. Please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment with your own experiences or theories. Have you encountered something you couldn't explain? Do you think these creatures are real, or am I just another person who got spooked in the woods and let their imagination run wild? I need to know I'm not alone in this. Because 6 months later, I still feel watched. I still hear sounds that don't belong. And sometimes, late at night when the city goes quiet, I wonder if it's still out there, curious, watching, waiting for the next person brave enough or foolish enough to spend a night alone in the deep woods. That stone is still on my desk, and sometimes I swear it's been moved.